Hi, this is the In Business discussion on communication skills, and I'm with Jeff, and I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fusel. I'm the CFO of commercial business for WellPoint, currently here in Indianapolis. I've been a CPA now for 25 years, with WellPoint for 3. Prior to that, I was the managing partner for PricewaterhouseCoopers here in Indianapolis. And prior to that, I started my career with Ernst & Winnie about 25 years ago.
We talk a lot about communication skills, but just how important are communication skills to a CPA and to a CPA firm?
You know, I think communication skills are incredibly important both to the CPA and to the CPA firm. I think we all think as a young CPA of our technical skills and acumen, but as we progress through our career, the communication skills become increasingly more important over time.
So what would you look at? You know, in terms of, we talk about characteristics of a good communicator. And one of the challenges that you have is identifying what makes a good communicator. So from your experience, how would you look at somebody and say, yeah, that person, that's a good communicator? What characteristics, traits, skills, what do they have?
Yeah, great question. You know, the first thing that comes to mind for me is sincerity and honesty. That a person comes across being very sincere and honest. They're not trying to sell you something. They're not trying to push something they don't themselves believe in. And they really come across as caring about what is in your best interest as opposed to what is in their best interest. And then beyond that, once you get through that caring, which I think is maybe the most important thing, it's how concise, how clear, how fully can you develop an idea and help somebody understand not only what the idea is, but what it'll mean to them down the road.
So there's a need to be authentic. We talk a lot about this idea of developing authentic leaders, authentic communicators, that you come across as being very real. There's almost an empathy that you need to have empathy skills to be able to be a good communicator. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
I think that's a very fair assessment, and also being true to yourself. We all learn, like, you should start every conversation with a joke to break the ice. You should do certain things, but if that's not who you are, that's not what you should do. You really have to capitalize on who you are as a person and how you communicate best. Whether you're communicating a technical subject or something, broader, it's really important, I think, to be yourself in your communication style, or you'll lose that authenticity we talked about.
I think that's a very important point. Looking at inside a firm, how much of an impact do communication skills have upon achieving business goals? So if you look at some of the typical business goals that we see, one of the ones that I always talk about whenever I go to a CPA firm, regardless of where it's been in the US, from Indianapolis through to California, they're talking about, we want to increase revenue, X% revenue growth over X number of years. And you know, a lot of firms will say, right, we're going to invest in technical skills, new technical skills, and they often miss these other things like communication skills. How important are communication skills in achieving business goals?
To truly understand how to convey a technical expertise, you have to be able to talk broadly about its application and how it applies to somebody's business. Not just in terms of what are the technical components of the rule, the reg, the IRS code, if it were, but how you would actually go about implementing it and how you would fit that kind of a strategy or a style or an approach into an organization's culture. So you really have to have the communication with the client to understand what their culture is and how receptive they'll be to your idea, and then how you would implement your idea to make it most successful in that organization.
So looking at the development of communication skills, and when we're talking about development, it's for the individual CPA, but also it's the impact upon their team, upon their wider firm, and perhaps more importantly, their clients. The question I've got for you, you've got so much experience, how have communications traditionally been developed in a CPA firm? And what do you see in terms of a need for the future when we're developing communication skills?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think traditionally, we've had courses that talk about what you should and shouldn't do, the checklists of things you should do to prepare and present, and how you should dress for success and those types of things. And I think oftentimes we as young CPAs were brought along to observe, to watch, to learn how things go. And all of those were good forms of training. But I think what I'm finding now is becoming more and more evolving is really a lot more of role playing. You know, internally practicing for a meeting in advance and putting different people in different roles. Right, and giving people a chance to actually do, right? Because it not only informs them and how to do it and the pressures of doing it, but it also informs the people who are actually going to do it to see a different style, a different approach, and learn something that they may not have thought of. I think that's a particularly important and effective technique because it also reminds people that you don't have to do it the way you saw somebody else do it, right? You need to do it the way it feels comfortable for you, and sometimes the way that feels comfortable for you might be the best way to actually go into the live meeting.
What's interesting, I like the idea of role play. I like the idea of experiencing something. I think that's fantastic for that traditional face-to-face approach. We're going into a meeting. Is something going to have to change for the future? And a question for you, if we look to the future and look at more interaction on digital networks, can you role play on digital interactions on digital networks? And perhaps that's a challenge for you to consider. But also, the same challenge to you. I mean, looking at the future of the CPA profession and the fact that we're now dealing with digital borders, you know, things like social media, we interact on LinkedIn, we can find clients from anywhere. The way we communicate on those platforms and the way we communicate virtually, is there a difference?
You know, it's a great question, and I don't know if I know the ultimate answer of where we're headed. But what I do know is it will be different. The ability to build a personal relationship with somebody when you're sitting physically with them, looking them in the eye, is different than it will be as you're looking at them through a digital lens, right? It may not be tremendously different, but it will certainly be different. I think what I think about in terms of communication is, how do you approach them? The timing of which you approach them. When do you approach them? Do you ping somebody when you need something every time, and do you build a relationship that says, oh no, Jeff's pinging me, that means he needs something? Or do you build a relationship that says, hey, Jeff's sending me something, I better read it because he only sends me stuff that's important to me. And so I think the style in which you interact becomes equally as important as the impetus for the interaction as well. Because you can ping somebody so often and so frequently now that it can lose its impact if you overdo it.
Yeah, and I see problems, and I'm interested to know if you'll see problems, because when we deal with electronic communication, when we're face-to-face, there are non-verbal cues that we're picking up on. You know, us talking now, there'll be things we're learning about each other because we're experiencing something about each other just by interacting. Sure. When we're dealing with things like email, as an example, I mean, I've got somebody that I now regard as a good friend, that when I first met him, he was so, it was so concise, I thought he was being abrupt, I thought he was being rude.
Sure.
Yeah, that's just his style, but I didn't know that because I'm not face-to-face with him. I'm having to interpret something in an email that I'm just looking at it through my lens. I put myself at the kind of the center of the conversation, and that's not, you know, if I communicated in that style, I would consider myself to be rude. Actually, that was just his approach to things. Yeah. Do you see that as having an impact? How can we coach or develop CPAs for that type of environment where that could be the first impression that a client gets?
It's a great question, and I don't know that there's a great answer, but what I would suggest is, I think about framing your style so somebody understands why you're doing it the way you're doing it. I remember seeing in the bottom of emails when iPads and iPhones first came out, apologize for the typos, right? Which I think at first made sense, but over time it's become, I'm too lazy to be precise with my communication.
Yeah.
And I think it's a negative now. But if it said, I apologize for the brevity of the note, right? And just framed it up that said something to that effect, you would say, well, they're not being abrupt. They recognize they're being very short, and there's a reason for that. Right, and there's an offer to have a further dialogue in more detail, be it on the phone or in Skype or whatever the medium might be. I think to frame that up is more important when you don't get the verbal, the visual cues that you would get from being in a face-to-face setting.
No, I agree with you. I'd like to thank Jeff. This has been fantastic, and as we do on all these courses, I'm now going to leave the last word with him. So Jeff, the question I've got for you, if you can give one piece of advice to the person watching this with regard to developing communication skills, what would it be?
I think my answer to that question would be, in your communications and everything you do, written and oral, are you doing it in a way that builds trust with the person with whom you're communicating? At the end of the day, a lot of CPAs are very technically smart, but it's trust that helps people make the decision as to who they really want to engage with and who they really want to be associated with and to rely on to give them advice and counsel.
Jeff, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.